Hola, yo soy Santiago del Solar, miembro del CREA 30 de agosto Marilauken de Zona Oeste. La relación e interacción de los sistemas productivos con los bienes comunes, como lo son la tierra, el aire y el agua, necesitan de una reevolución. Para ayudarnos a pensar ideas que nos permitan incorporar estos conceptos y a su vez la agenda del desarrollo sostenible en la agenda de nuestras empresas, lo invitamos al Dr. Jason Clay. Dr. Jason Clay, the stage is yours.
I'm going to be giving you a lot of information this afternoon. The talk is going to be available to anybody who wants it, and the email is at the end of the talk. If you have questions, send them via email, and I will answer them all within 24 hours. I think it may be a little strange for you to see somebody from an environmental organization talking to you today. WF is one of the oldest and largest global environmental NGOs. Our focus is biodiversity, ecosystem services, habitats, and protected areas. So why is somebody like me here today talking to you? And the answer is really very simple. We've come to realize that if we don't get where and how we produce food right, we won't have life on the planet as we know it. Here's what we've learned so far. Food is the biggest issue of our time. None of us are moving forward any agenda fast enough to address the issues of food. We have 7.4 billion food experts on the planet, and none of them are using science to shape their opinions. So we've got some pretty interesting challenges. And at the end of the day, if it comes down to chopping a tree or feeding your child, the child is going to win every time. So we have to find ways to produce food that anticipate those kinds of issues. Here's the situation, or here's the challenge. In the next 40 years, we have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. Food production is already the biggest impact on the planet. It's the biggest threat to life as we know it. It's caused the loss of 70% of biodiversity on land, and it's the largest single cause of habitat conversion. We use 70% of the fresh water that's used by people to produce food. We use more chemicals to grow food than any other human use of chemicals. It produces more pollution than any other human activity, and it also is responsible for between 25 and 35% of greenhouse gas emissions. We've lost about in the last 150 years, we've lost about half of the topsoil on the planet producing food. Going forward, we've got to figure out how to freeze the footprint of food. Today, we have about 1 unit of consumption for each 7 billion people. That comes to 7 billion units of consumption on the planet. By 2050, though, we're going to have at least 9 billion people, and on average, they're going to consume twice as much because they're going to have 2.9 times as much income. So that's 18 billion units of consumption. If the production of food is not going to have any more impacts than it has today, we have to shrink how many inputs we use to produce the food, the land we use, the water, the pesticides, the fertilizers. We have to shrink how many of each of those inputs we use by 62% to make it fit on today's planet. And I don't see the planet getting any bigger. We also have to address the speed of change on the planet today. It took the UK 155 years with 9 million people to double GDP. It took the US 53 years with 10 million people to double GDP. It took China just 12 years with more than 1 billion, and it took India just 17 years with 822 million. The speed of change for China was 12 times that of the UK, and for the scale, it was about 110 times that of the UK. What China did was phenomenal. It lifted 400 million people out of poverty in 12 years. Every government on the planet should try to do that. But when you move people out of poverty and they have more money to spend and they start to spend it on things like food, it has impacts. And we have to anticipate those impacts so that we can make sure that they don't affect the other things on the planet we want to maintain. So China doubled its GDP between 1983 and 1995. And for the next 6 or 8 years, the Chinese saved almost 40% of their earnings because they didn't trust that the wealth was going to last. But as they began to see and trust the system, they began to buy more things, and especially more food. And by 2008, and again 2011 and 12, they had big impacts on commodity prices. These yellow dots, there are 23 of them, were where food riots occurred on the planet, where somebody was killed. These food riots sparked the Arab Spring. There's no reason to assume that as the world gets wealthier and as food prices and commodity prices go up, we're not going to have an African fall or an Asian winter. We need to anticipate those issues. In short, food security is national security. But food security is not food self-sufficiency, and we have to be very clear about that. Global trade is going to be key to how we manage this planet. So, as I like to think about it, the issue isn't what to think. There's not a blueprint. I can't tell you what we need to do. The issue is how to think sideways, how to see issues and connect issues. It's like turning a kaleidoscope. If we turn it one notch, we see a whole different picture, and we see a whole different set of possibilities. So let's just take land. Today, we use about 40% of the terrestrial part of the planet to produce food. There's about 5% that's desert, about 18% that's mountains, lakes, rivers, and streams, about 2% that's cities, and about 12% that are in protection, in protected areas and national parks. What that leaves is about 23% of the land, which is where most of the biodiversity is. But the point here is, if we're using 40% of the land already, we have no room to double it. We only have 23% of the land that's still left that could be used, and it would have high costs to biodiversity if we used it. So the question is, how do we make production more efficient? How do we produce more with less? The key is going to be trade. We have to produce the things where we can produce them most efficiently and ship them to places that produce them much less efficiently. That means we need to export animal protein, not feed, not cereals and grains. If we export animal protein, we can keep the manure and the waste into closed-loop systems and replenish the soils that are being used to feed the plants to produce the grain. Food is cheap. In the US, it's about 10% of the budget of the average household. But 1 billion people can't afford food today at its current price. And the other little secret that nobody talks about is that half of farm families don't produce enough food on their own farms or enough cash from their production to feed their families. In fact, most malnutrition and most stunting on the planet are on farms. They're not in cities. Malnutrition is not an urban issue, it's a rural issue. So subsidies, people talk about it a lot, but what most people don't realize is that China subsidizes agriculture twice as much as the US and Europe combined. India subsidizes agriculture at the same level as the US and Europe combined, and Brazil, until its recent financial crisis, was subsidizing agriculture at 3 times the US. Subsidies kill innovation. Subsidies are the last thing we want when we want to learn to think outside the box, to create new strategies, to do new technologies, etc. But who do you think subsidizes food production the most? If you took all those countries and added them up and multiplied it by 10, you still wouldn't get to the level of subsidies that are provided by the planet. The planet provides the resources that we use, and it's not compensated. We're overusing water, we're overusing soil, we're polluting the air, we're polluting the water. The planet is absorbing these externalities, and that isn't going to be able to go on forever. So by 2050, we need to double food availability. How are we going to do that? We think there's 4 ways. On the one hand, we've got to increase productivity and efficiency, and on the other, we have to reduce waste and consumption. Those are the ways we move forward. Put another way, on a finite planet, should consumers have a choice about whether they buy sustainable products or not? Or should all the choices on the shelf be more sustainable? If we want all the choices on the shelf to be more sustainable, then we have to work with the companies and their supply chains to ensure that that's the case. 2 questions come out of this. In the US, the average consumer spends 2.9 seconds making a choice in a retail grocery operation. In Europe, it's a little more, it's maybe 4.5 seconds. What consumer is going to make an informed choice in that amount of time? It's just not going to happen. Today we waste 1 in 3 calories. That means we eat 2 and there's 1 that's wasted. So waste is 50% of what we eat, what we waste. If you look at it another way, waste is half of what we need to do to double food production over what we currently have. But there's some other ways to look at waste also that I think are important. If food production is 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, then waste is 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions because we waste 1 in 3 calories. If we use 70% of all water on the planet that's used by people to produce food, and 1/3 of it's wasted, then 23% of all water used by people is used to produce food waste. If we want to have a good water strategy, why don't we start with food waste? Food waste is the lowest hanging fruit in terms of how we build a better food system. But also, instead of converting habitat like forest or grasslands or wetlands, why don't we rebuild the soils that we've already used and degraded? Brazil has rebuilt about 10 million hectares of soil, including pastures like this that are now producing soy and sugarcane, etc. Why don't we have a global target of 250 million hectares by 2030? That would produce about 10% of the calories we need on the planet. That's a good strategy. That's a way to take land conversion off the table. I mentioned that we use 70% of all the fresh water that's used by people to produce food. What that comes to is 1 liter per calorie. So here's the question going forward. can we produce 2 calories of food with half a liter of water on average? How do we do that? Part of it's saving food from waste. Part of it's efficiency. Part of it's different crops. We need to think about that more carefully. Genetics gets a lot of attention. We wouldn't have cities without plant breeding and without animal husbandry. We would have never created ways to amass food that can support people that don't raise their own food. So from my perspective, it's not a question of if genetics, it's a question of which genetics. We need to use 21st century technologies to solve 21st century problems. We need to use marker-assisted breeding and hybrids. In the US, hybrids themselves for corn increased productivity 4-fold. Half of the world's farmers today don't plant hybrid corn. We need to disseminate technologies more faster than we have to date. Better practices. It's hard to be against better practices, but today's better practice, or best practice even, is tomorrow's norm, and the one after that we're trying to get rid of. But let me ask, which is actually going to give us more food in the end? Rewarding the producers who are already best, or actually moving the rest of producers? We've spent a lot of time understanding the production curves for different crops. And we've developed voluntary standards, certification programs to reward farmers that do a better job. We can pull the top 25% of farmers that way. But here's another one of those little inconvenient truths. The bottom 25% of farmers, the poorest performers, the ones that are least efficient, produce 50% of the impacts and 10% of the product. If we want a strategy to raise more food, to produce more food and reduce impacts, we work with the bottom side of the performance curve, not the top. We need to move the bottom, and that requires government as well. And it's certainly not going to be possible for the private sector to pull the bottom along with it. Government has to be there to help. We have a global commodity trading system that is incredibly efficient. It was founded right about the same time as interchangeable parts were invented in the 1820s, 1830s. It's interchangeable products. 1 ton of corn equals 1 ton of corn regardless of where it's produced. 1 ton of sugar equals 1 ton of sugar. It's built on physical attributes, weights and measures, quality, color, foreign matter, health and safety. How it became so efficient was that we stripped out every bit of information within the commodity about who produced it, where they produced it, how they produced it, what the impacts were. Well, guess what? That's exactly what consumers and retailers and brands want to know today. They want to know who produced the product, where, how, and with what impacts. We want intangible values to be represented: organic, non-GMO, no child labor, zero deforestation, traceability. We have to figure out how to bring all this information into the system using today's information technology, but we cannot afford to lose the efficiency of traditional commodity trading. That's the challenge of the 21st century, to shift this system. And then there's climate change. How is climate change going to affect agriculture? So I assume most people in this room are not averse to eating chocolate. Most of the polls show that 90% of people eat chocolate and the other 10% are lying. So this is where we grow 70% of the world's chocolate today. 2 countries in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. This is where in just 14 years it's going to be the most suitable for growing cocoa in those same countries. Climate change is going to shift where we produce crops and what we produce. In the short term, climate change is going to push producers to be more efficient, to address the diseases that stress brings from climate change, both for plants and animals, in both tree crops and row crops. In the medium term, it means producers are either going to change their crops or are going to change genetics of the same crop. But one way or the other, they're going to have to make some changes. One of the biggest shifts in the 21st century is that more people are eating more animal protein. We know that every country that has development where per capita income is increased consumes more animal protein, but what they consume varies a lot. In India, it's eggs and milk. India consumes 25% of the world's eggs, and by 2050 is expected to consume 40%. In China, it was pork and then chicken and then seafood, and now it seems to be all three. The only animal protein that has actually increased productivity and efficiency over the last 30 or 40 years at the same rate that we need all crops on the planet to increase over the next 40 years is poultry. And they did it through a combination of different things, from reducing feed conversion to reducing mortality to reducing the age of the bird at the harvest price and increasing the weight when the bird is harvested. But what they didn't do was address how much water was being used, how many medications were being used, and whether the birds were allowed to roam free or not. Those are conditions that are now being put on animal protein, and that's what global markets are increasingly asked for. It's going to make animal protein less efficient, and yet we still have to figure out how to use our resources more efficiently. In short, we've got to shift from maximizing one variable to optimizing a number of key ones, some of which may be at odds with each other. It's not going to be particularly easy. And then there's beef. Beef is perhaps the poster child of inefficient land use in food production. Leaving aside feed crops and just looking at pasture, beef takes about 70% of the land used by people today to produce crops, to produce food. And it produces about 1.3% of the calories. Now, beef produces a lot more nutrients than that, so it's maybe 3.5%, 4% of nutrients. But going forward, I think the question is going to be, can we produce 10% of the nutrients and 4 or 5% of the calories on 30% of the land, not 60%? If we're going to start meeting these metrics, we have to really start measuring. I don't have data for Argentina around beef, but I do for the US. And in the last 30 plus years, the US has increased the amount of beef it produces using fewer animals, less feed, less water, and less land. They've also reduced the amount of greenhouse gas emission sources from manure, from methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2. But here's one of the big things that they've really done, is that they produce the same amount of meat with 4 animals as it used to be with 5. They do it with less feed, with less manure, and in 20% less time to market. So it's about sustainability pursuing 5 or 10 different strategies that incrementally add up to something significant. The real question for us today on the planet is, how do we move sustainability from a niche product that a consumer might want to pay more for to the norm, where they're all the products on the shelf? And I want to talk just a bit about what some producers and companies around the world are doing on this. Unilever has made a commitment that 100% of all the raw materials they buy, that's about 3,400 raw materials, will be certified as sustainable by 2020. They're not going to make it. And they know they're not going to make it. But they thought it was more important to make a big commitment and then keep pushing towards it, even if it takes longer, than to make a smaller commitment. They're going to get about 80 or 85% of the way there. But it's hard to find oregano that's sustainable. It's hard to find cinnamon and vanilla and a lot of the different spices and flavorings that they use. The Consumer Goods Forum, about 400 global retailers and brands that represent more than $3 trillion in sales each year, have made a commitment to take deforestation out of their supply chains. And they're starting with beef and soy and palm oil and pulp and paper. It's only 2 countries, Indonesia and Brazil. But this has sent a shock through the world to the point that the traders have all now agreed to take deforestation out of palm oil, and Cargill has made a commitment to take deforestation out of all of its supply chains for all crops. The only country that I'm aware of that has made a commitment to more sustainable food is Ireland, which committed that by 2016, 100% of its food exports would be third-party certified as sustainable. And Ireland's not going to make it either, but they're getting closer. 90% of all the beef in Ireland is exported, 70% of all the dairy, and 80% of the producers for each of those commodities are now incorporated into a government database where they report their impacts, their inputs, and their results, and they can compare their performance with all their peers, their neighbors, people in the same county, and people further away. This is the only country that has made a commitment like this. The salmon aquaculture industry is the only industry where the entire sector has made a similar commitment. 17 CEOs of companies that represent 70% of all the salmon aquaculture production in the world have agreed to share their data, to work pre-competitively with each other to actually reduce the impacts of salmon production and increase the efficiency. So they're talking about their investments, about what works, what doesn't work, the rate of return, the ROIs and the payback periods. All of this is in a public, accessible document where anybody can see how the entire industry is getting better through continuous improvement. The reason the salmon industry did this, and I think other industries are going to follow suit, is because they found that their license to operate, their ability to produce in the countries where they were producing in, was being limited by the perceptions of what the worst producers were doing. And similarly, their access to markets, to the best markets in the world, was being restricted because of what the worst producers was doing. So because of those two things, the best producers began to work with those producers to make them better. So why are these producers and these companies focusing so much on sustainability? They see their biggest risk in the future as the availability of raw materials and the reputational risk associated with how they're produced. So they want to move away from spot market purchases to more partnerships over time with 5, 10, 15-year contracts that then the producers can use to raise the money to make investments in longer-term sustainability strategies. In 1975, 83% of the value of a company was tangible assets, things that you could touch, machinery, productive plants, land, etc. Today, it's 19%. Today, the reputation of a company, the brand of a company, what consumers think of you, what others think of you is your most important value, and that's why sourcing raw materials better is being pushed so hard today. We have a saying in Missouri, where I come from, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I think we know where we have to get by 2050. I heard something walking over here today to give this talk, which I think is fantastic news for Argentina, and it goes something like this. The best secret is that farmers don't have secrets from each other. They may have them from government, but not from each other. That's the kind of attitude that's going to let us learn faster. Learn at the speed and scale of change that's required on the planet today. Thank you very much.